Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Jennifer Pahlka, who is a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, also the founder of Code for America and the founder of the U.S. Digital Services, which you did when you were, I guess, deputy CTO of the United States under the Obama administration. Also the author of this book, this fantastic book called Recoding America, Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So look, I really enjoyed this book because, I teach a lot of these things here at UC Berkeley on digital transformation, on, a data strategy, talk about things like agile, VC mindset, all this stuff. And for people who are in the private sector, we kind of tear our hair out when we think about the government and, why the government doesn't seem to be adopting any of this stuff, right? They don't seem to be adopting design thinking. They don't seem to be adopting agile. And because I work at a public university, it's kind of somewhere in between. It's a lot of the stories that I was reading about in the book reminded me of some of the experiences that I've had working at a public university. And I think that the people in the private sector, maybe including the folks who were involved in the Doge project, they just can't seem to figure out, what is it with the government? Why doesn't the government get their act together? Why don't they adopt any of these practices? And, they come up with all sorts of theories and point fingers and, blame people. But, you really dig into it. And the thing that I really loved, the insight that really stuck with me when I read the book, is that when people think about kind of waterfall versus agile, they're thinking primarily about the technology. But really, this is about, organizational architecture and, process design and so forth. And so, if we're going to actually make our government more functional, and maybe even as good as some of the third world countries out there that do it better than we do, we need to kind of rethink how we do things. And in particular, we have to think about bringing more stuff in-house. And that to me was a big light bulb moment, because I think for a lot of economists, we think, just outsource stuff, just outsource stuff. And that can create all sorts of problems. So Jennifer, maybe, I don't know where we can start. We can start maybe when you actually went from Code for America to having an actual position inside the belly of the beast and what that was like.
Yeah, it was an eye-opening. I kind of thought, I know government because I've been working with, city governments and state governments through Code for America for a little while here. It hadn't been that long. And it was, I didn't, it is different to see it from the outside and actually walk in the shoes of a public servant. You really feel it. You really start to feel that risk aversion, and you get this empathy for the way people act. That is, from the outside, it's easy to sort of clench your fists and shout. And the inside, you're like, no, it's actually so much harder than it looks. For all the reasons you were just talking about. One thing I really learned going in that I think I just could not have theorized, just sitting outside looking at things, was just how much the government is set up to not care about implementation at all. It's just not what powerful people think about. They think about the politics and they think about the policy. And if they're if you sort of say we need people around to make a website to implement that policy, they do exactly, what you pointed out, which is, right, we hire those people out and they're not important to us, right? They're not in on the discussion. They're not helping us craft the policy. They are doing exactly what we tell them to do. That's what contracting is. We get really, really specific about what we want. We bid it out. We get these people and they come in. And they should just do exactly what we tell them to do because we're the smart ones. And, we know how this should work, both in terms of the policy and then all the compliance stuff around contracting. And that just turns out to really not work. but the resistance to really rethinking that, not just as like, did you have the wrong, procurement strategy? Did you use the wrong vehicle? Is it agile development or waterfall development? But much more like, no, what is the structure that's going to create digital services that work for people? What is the implementation of our policies that's going to get the actual outcome that was intended? And how do we implicate like this whole enterprise in that? And are we willing to see all of the assumptions, that implementation sort of being something that really only lower level people do? If you're not willing to really question those things, we're not really going to get a better government. And I think that's why, when Doge came along, it's not that people thought that Doge was right. It's that people knew that what we were doing is wrong. And they wanted some kind of change.
But I mean, that seems like a bigger problem. I mean, you could move into other domains. If you think about architects and, construction folks, right? I mean, if you're an architect, you can spin up all sorts of wonderful designs and they look pretty on paper, but then you hand it over to the construction people and they're like, yo, we can't build this, right?
But then that's the thing. Critically, then there's a back and forth, right?
Yeah.
And you get out of this linear sort of step function thing where, you had this idea and it just gets implemented. And at each step down through that implementation, nobody gets, to say, wait a minute, we got to go back and look at those requirements. We got to go back and challenge this. Turns out that when you implement this policy in the way that you're telling me, we get a really perverse outcome. If there's no feedback loop to send that information back up to the decision makers, you get a lot of wasted money, you get a lot of perverse outcomes, you get a lot of angry people. But when the architects can say, or the builders can say, actually no, you go into a discussion about that, then you have, not just an agile development process, but you have a more agile government process. And, the stories I tell in the book really are about, especially at the end when I'm trying to be a little bit more positive, people tell me the first part of the book's pretty bleak. When we get more positive, it's about public servants actually giving that pushback and giving that feedback and saying, in the case of, Yadira Sanchez at CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, she's asked to implement this law called MACRA, Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act. And she's going, if we implement it the way you are telling us to implement it, this law that is designed to get patients better quality care for paying more for, good outcomes, is going to make all these doctors quit the program. They're going to leave because it's so frustrating to them. And we're actually going to get a worse quality of care. And there's like all these ways, these tiny little, details. Well, they're actually not that tiny, but from high up, they look tiny. That she has to say, no, let me show you why this can't happen exactly the way you thought it would happen if you want the outcomes you're telling me you intend.
Right now, look, I mean, in the private sector, in a competitive market, I mean, companies realize this. And so they tend to bake in a process where there is this back and forth and this communication. And then, the architectural design will evolve over time. At UC Berkeley, when we decided we wanted to build a new building, we also have to adhere to these government procurement rules. And so before we could actually shop the design to all of these construction firms for competitive bidding, we had to have you have to have the plan completely finalized. Otherwise, the bids that come in, you can't compare apples to apples. I mean, so there's a certain logic to this, right? I mean, procurement rules didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, they're serving a particular purpose, right? Which is accountability and transparency and so forth, right? And so, where did that come from? And because at some point, you talk about the kind of glory days of the U.S. government, Grace Hopper and everything, where they did stuff internally. Why is it that we started pushing all of this stuff, out into contract rather than doing it in-house?
Well, there's a couple questions in there. Certainly a lot of procurement rules came from graft, and there really was a lot of it. You go back before the progressive era, and I don't mean the current definition of progressives, but the turn of the century progressive reform movement. Your government was a mess. Like, you just gave contracts to whoever did you favors or pays you off, and that was not good, right? Like, we love the progressives; they did some really important stuff, and we don't want to return to that. But I have this concept that I've sort of since named. It's in the book, but I gave it a name afterwards. Of the cascade of rigidity, right? And it, basically, you can have good rules, but if you start applying them extremely rigidly, you create a whole different framework that's just as gameable as graft, right? Like, we don't get the best contractors on things because we get the contractors who are good at, this mountains and mountains of compliance and, mountains and mountains of, procure, like the skill of how to actually procure. They're not the best at doing the job. They're just the best at getting through what's become a very rigid and complex system.
In fact, there are some firms that do services for the government that don't do any services for non-governmental clients, right?
Because, tons. And right? a lot of companies that work with the private sector won't work with government because they have to hire so many people to handle all of this that it really changes the culture of the company. I mean, if you have a giant chunk of your company dedicated to understanding the, sort of Kafka-esque procurement system and also making sure the company is compliant with a whole bunch of things. It's, it's like even access to your building, like that just changes your culture. They're just like, it's not worth it. I want to be a lean, fast learning company, and I can't if I'm taking government contracts. You really do get this bifurcation. And of course, some companies do both. But it just means you're never getting the best of the public sector, of the private sector, because of all of these rules. And it doesn't mean that we should have no rules and return to pre-progressive era government. It means that we should constantly refresh them and be asking, which of these rules is important and, an important safeguard? Which of these is actually getting the outcomes we intend? How do we pare these down? They accumulate over time. And so, what really could be 4 or 5 rules, it's like 400 rules. You just got to make some choices. Like, there's all stuff like that that's going on. But you were also asking not just about the procurement rules, you're asking about sort of what gets done inside of government and what gets contracted out.
Yeah, the make or buy decision, right?
Yeah. And I don't think it's a binary, but we've gone really far to the extreme of it's all outsourced. I mean, there's this thing you hear in government, you need one throat to choke, right? Like, I learned this first in how governments procure benefit systems, like the websites and back end that are used to let people apply for and receive SNAP benefits, for instance. Like, you want to have just one contractor who's entirely responsible for it. I mean, they may be subbing stuff out. But what they are really doing is abdicating responsibility to those contractors. And that doesn't mean they're saying do whatever you want. They do come up with these incredibly detailed sets of requirements. Yeah. I mean, when I was working on unemployment insurance during the pandemic, they were about to roll out an RFP for a new business system modernization, they called it. And I think it had 7,000 something requirements in it. Like, that's 11 years of work. They have literally been working on this procurement for 11 years, which of course meant like it was wildly outdated even before the pandemic hit, when we just realized everything wasn't working and it needed to be completely rethought. But you have this sense that like once you hand that off, they just are going to go do it. So, this is deadly to test and learn, right? Test and learn is what we're talking about when I say Yadira is pushing back and saying this isn't going to work. We have to adjust. We're trying this with doctors. It's not working. They don't want to use it. We've got to do something different. But if you just hand off 7,000 requirements 11 years later and hope that they would send you something back another 11 years from now, there's going to be no learning happening. Where the learning happens is when you sort of compress all that distance between the people who understand what we're trying to deliver for people or for a particular outcome and the people actually doing it. And so when you put contracting and procurement and like all this stuff in there and just sort of set it and let it go, there's just many, 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 many layers. When you have an internal team, even if they're not doing everything internally, they can just pick up from the user research. Oh, this isn't working. We've got to pivot. Let's make a change. And you have a much, much faster learning cycle. But I do talk about sort of where we went wrong on this. And, it was started in the 60s, this idea of what was inherently governmental. And it's funny because I don't think the concept is wrong, but we started to define this concept. Like, if it's a policy decision, it has to be done by government staff, right? If it's just implementation, you can contract that out. And the theory starting in the mid 60s was you should, like anything you can contract out, you should. But if it's policy, you can't. Well, is it a policy decision? Like, okay, I shared the story, a little bit of the story of Yadira Sanchez. Like, Congress said, for instance, in this law that she's implementing, doctors who only take a small number of Medicare patients are exempt from this. Well, somebody has to interpret that rule. And when CMS interprets it as make everybody go through the program the first year, then figure out who's under the cutoff, and then exempt them, the consequences of that, implementation, in heavy air quotes, decision, are that all the doctors who take very few Medicare patients will drop out of the program because they cannot afford all the new electronic healthcare record systems and all the training. They can't afford to onboard to a system for 1 year that they're never going to use, which is exactly not the intent of the law. And so is that a policy decision or is that an implementation decision? Well, it is a decision that is best informed by someone who is actually talking to the doctors and knows what's actually going to happen. And so this line between what's policy and what's implementation gets really, really blurred, or at least it needs to move down. Like, there are many more decisions that really do need to be made by someone who is a government employee who has this, policy-making decision, can be deeply informed by what the contractors are saying. But we have to have our own view. We have to have our own touch points with, the end user of these systems to know what those consequences are going to be. Because if you don't, you've got people on the ground who know that this is going to push many doctors out of Medicare, which is a terrible outcome, who work for contractors, who say, it's not my job I have no voice. I am not supposed to have an opinion on policy decisions. There's no path for them to send that information back up in. So there's just so many examples. There's just a small one of where, having at least a reasonable sized team, and I'll call that a product team. So we're talking more and more about what that actually looks like, trying to get concrete about it, that does what we call product management in-house. And that often includes that user research that would have told you that the doctors are going to drop out if you implement the policy this way. Having that team in-house just gets you way, way better outcomes. And it's just been conventional wisdom, I would say, across both Democrats and Republicans, that is something you would outsource. It's no longer true, I think. And it's also no longer true that Republicans are against this. Like, I work with a lot of folks on the right who are grappling with the hollowing out of the expertise of government, the idea that everything is outsourced all the time. And the way that has not gotten us a smaller government, it's gotten us a bigger, but clunkier, more unwieldy, frustrating government. And in fact, insourcing the right positions that do things like product management, is really amenable and to the goals of both the left and the right. This is one of these weird places where there's increasingly enormous agreement, and that's why you see the Doge folks advocating for insourcing, which, people used to associate with more of the progressives, like we want a bigger government. But like, there's some serious realignment happening here, folks.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach strategy in industrial organization, we talk about make or buy, and it makes sense to buy when you can draw up a fully specified contract where you're not going to need to, modify it, for any reason. So, if we're procuring paper clips, for instance, makes perfect sense. Government doesn't need to be making paper clips, right? You can go buy them from Staples or whoever. And so, at what point did we think that IT was something that was, best obtained through this arm's length contracting process rather than something that is kind of, difficult to contract around? And the fact is that, we didn't even have a CIO or a CTO in the U.S. government until fairly recently. And even when we had them, they weren't really kind of reporting directly to the CEO, which is what would happen at a typical private company.
Yeah, and there's two things. First one, as you said, there weren't people who understood digital in the power centers making decisions, and there still aren't enough of those people. But some of this is just an artifact of the timing of it, right? So when some of these laws were written, like the Brooks Act, which I think is 1965, they're looking at automatic data processing, which by that point had become really commoditized, and saying, we should just do this essentially through GSA or whatever it was they were trying to do. Like, when something is a commodity, you buy it the way you buy paper clips. Great. Get the best price. Great. But when the internet came along, it sort of got mistaken for like more automatic data processing. Like the sort of emergent nature of it was lost. It was still seen by people who don't engage in that, digital stuff as just, more of what those companies could be selling us, and we should just get a good price for it. And the strategic nature of it just went way over their heads. To them, what's strategy and important is the politics and the policymaking. And I think, not only did you have the Brooks Act in 1965 when, it was great time to, treat automatic data processing as a commodity. But then the next law that comes along, sort of, I think an important one would be the Klinger-Cohen Act in 1995, where they're looking at dealing with the increased importance of computing in government, but it's just before the internet changes everything. So they locked in a bunch of stuff right as we should have been opening up our understanding of this, not trying to lock it down. And I kind of think about this moment, right? Because we were overdue for sort of for really looking at how government buys and builds technology in 1995. And because we were overdue.
This was like the reinventing government era, right? It was Al Gore and all that.
It is, but Klinger-Cohen was pretty separate from reinventing government. I mean, there was this fantastic report, I mentioned it in the book, and I'm not sure I can remember the name right now. Oh yeah, it was called Computer Chaos, right? That looked at all of the bad, the ways we were doing digital really badly in 1995. And Klinger-Cohen was designed to fix those problems. And I don't think it was not like the people who wrote it were very smart, and they were outraged about all the same things we're outraged about today. But they didn't see what was coming, and they didn't skate to where the puck was going to be. They were trying to solve yesterday's problems. So I think it's important to point out, because we are at a similar moment today, right? AI, we're in the beginning of the AI era. And I see a lot of my peers that I've worked with over the past 15, 20 years on this whole government digital thing going, great, let's finally win the battles that we have been fighting for the past 15 years to pull government into like the mid 2010s, right when we need to be pulling government into 2030, right? We need to skate to where the puck is going to be. And I'm guilty of that myself sometimes. I'm like so eager to finally win some of these battles that we've been losing for so long that we forget that you should never fight yesterday's battles.
Yeah, well, look, I understand the problem after the procurement has been set, Okay, it's very difficult to learn. I think you said that's when learning stops. But isn't there more opportunity to learn before the requirements are set? I mean, whatever happened to the notice and comment process? Isn't that supposed to elicit some insight into, hey, this isn't going to work, or, hey, there's going to be this problem with the doctors and so forth? I mean, why doesn't that stuff kind of percolate up through that notice and comment process?
Well, notice and comment is focused on the policy, not the implementation. And that's, again, this myopia of government that we just don't engage. I mean, a lot of the people who worked at USDS and did this kind of transformation work in various parts of government will, complain pretty loudly about notice and comment because it never actually gets you it doesn't really get you the input you want. I mean, imagine saying to a SNAP recipient, we really want your feedback. Please go to the Federal Register and find this notice and read through this really try it. Go on the Federal Register, pick a page. None of those words make any sense to a normal human being, right? And they're all about the finer details of the policy. If you want to know how to make SNAP better for people, watch them try to use a form. Watch them try to apply. That is not what the notice and comment process does. It asks for comments on very abstract, complex, in the weeds language of policy that normal people are not able to translate into what. And in fact, not only could you not figure out how that's going to get translated, you don't know how that's going to get translated because it's not getting feedback on the interfaces that people use.
Well, I mean, you talk about some of these situations where the people who are actually implementing the policy aren't even aware of the practical consequences. Like they don't even know that most people can't access the website. And, in a way they don't care, right? Because that has nothing to do with their career advancement, right? I mean, and again, I don't think anybody wants to blame people because it's all about the incentives, right? That are set up inside government. So, why is it that user experience research is not only non-existent, but it's discouraged and maybe even illegal?
Yeah. Okay. A lot there. First, let me just say on the notice and comment thing that the other big problem with notice and comment is it's just captured, right? Because it's so
yeah, I think you mentioned that some of these companies, like Oracle, I mean, they want everything to be, exactly the way it is because they have a competitive advantage in winning these bids, right?
Yeah, I mean, notice and comment, it's not just like tech companies like Oracle. If you are, putting notice and comment out about a rule change in Snap, for instance, the only people who will actually, comment on that are people who are paid to do that. Your average Snap recipient doesn't go on there. By contrast, user research says, let me go out and find the people who are the, likely users of this form and figure out what their experience will be like. Do they understand this? Can they access it? Do these words mean anything to them? What do we need to change to make this work? It's an active, actively going out to the users, not the people who have time to engage. And yes, as you were alluding to, we're getting better, but there has definitely been this sense that user research in government is illegal because of a well-intentioned law from from 1980 and then was updated in 1995 called the Paperwork Reduction Act, which I insist on referring to as the comically misnamed Paperwork Reduction Act because it has created so much paperwork that not just for people in government, I think paperwork that is not valuable, but it is the unintended consequence of actually making paperwork worse for the American public. And basically, by wanting to have a central function that said, look, as an agency, you can't just go out there and collect information from the public. We're afraid that the agencies are just going to burden the public way too much. So we need all of these requests to go through this central authority called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
So you couldn't even do an unstructured interview because you'd have to have every single question pre-cleared, right?
Well, now you're getting into the weeds here. You could have, because if you look at the guidance that's been put out for many years from OIRA on this, it says that unstructured interviews actually are fine. Like, as long as you're not asking the same question over. If it's a survey, like I'm asking 10 people these 10 questions, exact 10 questions, then if it's 10 or more, then it has to get Paperwork Reduction Act clearance through OIRA, which takes really long time. So people just don't do it. But even though you could, in theory, if you're not asking the exact same questions over and over again, it's not subject to PRA clearance. You have this, again, cascade of rigidity and risk aversion that causes the agencies to say, better safe than sorry, let's get clearance anyway. We're afraid of somebody being, upset at us, or we're afraid of creating a vulnerability. Someone might sue us for, PRA, lack of compliance with PRA. I've even heard of agencies where they design the user research to only talk to 8 people. So it's under what's, the statutory limit. It literally says just 10 or up in the statute. And the PRA officers in the agencies will say to the user researcher, well, that is not consistent with the spirit of the PRA. You're just gaming it. And so even with your 8-person sample size, we're still making you go through clearance. Now, to be clear, going through clearance doesn't mean going through clearance. It means that the research will not happen. Because you cannot wait a year for your research plan to be approved, and that is sort of what was going on. So it unfortunately had just the exact, when you don't do user research on your web forms or whatever it is, you make really bad interfaces to government that people hate using, because no one realizes that no one knows how to answer this question.
Yeah, but look, you don't have to do interviews to find out that, let's say, 80% of the people who start on the form just drop off before they finish the form, right? I mean, that's just data, and that's in a private company, you would be looking at that and saying, hey, we have this many people who are qualified, and only a small percentage are actually doing this. Like, what's going on here, right? What gives? And you can also, usually you can find out just by looking at it without actually, just observing the behavior without actually doing any interviews.
But that's not anyone's job in many government systems. And as you spoke to the incentives are to create a 7,000 requirement list, and hand it off to a contractor and have them hand it back, and then have a IV&V vendor and independent verification and validation vendor go check to see that all those 7,000 requirements were fulfilled, and then you're done. And that's your incentive, is to do all of that. It is not to go look and see that 80% of your people are dropping off on question 6 because no one knows how to answer it. And in fact, your requirements never included an instrumentation of the website to even give you that information. It is no one's job to be monitoring that. And once the contract is done, to go back and fix that would require another whole work order, a change order. That you're deeply disincented to change anything later, because then the way the system works, it looks like you got something wrong, right? Well, if you're trying to change something now, you must have missed something, and then you were bad on your requirements, So the incentives are all wrong. As you say, it is not that public servants are lazy or stupid. It's that the system that they're working in is just ill fit. It's just ill suited to the job we needed to do.
Right. So you're saying if you're asked to build concrete boats, you're going to build concrete boats. Your job is not to, question the buoyancy of the boat, right?
Well, yeah. So you're referring to the story I have in the book of this guy at the Veterans Administration, which, by the way, has gotten so much better. It's kind of a leader now. But I'm questioning him about this project that we're working on at the USDS. It was proto USDS. Before it was one of the first engagements that was sort of testing out the thesis of the USDS, and I kept asking this guy, who's a senior leader in technology in the VA, like, why is it built this way? Why did you make this decision? And over it, he says, that's not my call. You got to ask the procurement people or the program people or the compliance people. He just didn't have answers. And I asked him why he was so, deferring on all of these. And he said, if they ask us to build a concrete boat, we'll build a concrete boat. And I said, why? And he said, well, because that way when it doesn't work, it's not our fault.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the incentives. Your incentive is to make sure that when it doesn't work, it's someone else's fault. Now, this is all stuff that I'm talking about from like 2013. It's 2025. And I just want to make the point that there has been a lot of change, particularly in the VA. And the VA is like killing it these days. It's, not perfect. There's still big problems with this whole, electronic healthcare exchange between the DoD and the VA. The medical stuff still has a lot of problems, but the benefits access is actually quite good now. And, famously, or I don't know if people, maybe it's not famous, but there was that guy who came in through DOJ, the DOJ guy who was assigned to the VA, who got fired for saying, actually, things work quite well here. And that's because since 2013, Charles Worthington has been the CTO. I guess he didn't go in 2013. I think he went in probably 2016 or something. But he's been there for quite a while now. Just, that, what do they call it? The slow boring of hard boards, just over and over again, getting that agency to adopt these new practices. You had people like Kurt Del Bene come in and sort of give him air cover from the top, and just changing the model. It's not they got better programmers. It's that they're changing the operating model, which includes a lot more than just the way you develop software. It's how you hire. It's the procedures and being able to reduce the procedural bloat. It's certainly digital systems, and it's, are you actually creating an environment in which people can test and learn? All of that stuff is it can be very hard to change over time, certain disruptive moments notwithstanding.
Well, maybe you could talk about this accountability trap, because again, I think you see this. It's not just in government. I mean, you see it in other places as well, but it seems to incentivize, cover your ass behavior. It seems to, discourage any kind of risk taking, and it encourages sort of a willful blindness as to the actual effects of the policies that you're executing, right?
Yeah, I mean, public servants are very much caught in this trap where they are held accountable to the process, even when the process doesn't get the outcome. And so we, as the public, are frustrated about the bad outcome, but for them to pursue the outcome at the expense of the process puts their career at risk. And in fact, sometimes it's more than just their career. I mean, people can get, they can get fined for these things. I mean, there's a huge exaggeration of the risks to them. I used to be told all the time when I was in government, you're going to get thrown in procurement jail. I was like, there's not actually such a thing as procurement jail. But people will tell you could go to jail for that all the time. And you're like, yeah. I might get my hand slapped. I might not get a promotion, but I don't think I'm actually going to go to jail. But there have been, real, it's not completely out of the question, but it's more career risk, right? And so where does that account?
Well, in other words, if somebody wants to get rid of you, they need an excuse. And so it's not like, you're going to get fired for doing this. You're probably going to get fired because they don't like you, but now they have a way of getting rid of you, right?
Yeah. And they might not like you because you're rocking the boat.
Yeah.
Right. It's moving everybody's cheese, right? The jobs that a lot of people do are just, they may do them quite well and very diligently, but they're the wrong jobs very often. And so when you try to change the model, suddenly people's jobs are different. They don't necessarily like that. And yeah, it does create real risk, not because you've created risk for the public, but because you've created a lot of risk for the system and the people who are comfortable in it. But I do think it's important to talk, if you talk about the accountability trap, to remember that this comes ultimately from us, right? It comes from the public and from our politicians who, we kind of want it both ways. We don't trust our government. So we don't want public servants to use any judgment. Like we want them to like just.
And that's nonpartisan, right? I mean, the conservatives and the liberal, they both agree on that, right?
For different reasons, yeah, but they kind of came to the same conclusion, like that the best government is one that, like, where, bureaucrats just are so constrained that they're only painting, just it's a paint by numbers thing, and like you just don't get creative, because they're for a whole bunch of reasons. But when you create that environment and the journalists that you read and listen to, or get write exposés about, so-and-so who like didn't check this box on this thing or whatever, you are creating that accountability trap, which makes our government extremely risk averse. And the outcomes of that risk aversion are a government that you don't like.
Yeah. And you also talk about how oftentimes it's kind of a game of, whisper down the lane where it's better to err on the side of kind of more requirements as opposed to fewer, right? And of course, if you're a product manager, then you're constantly thinking about these trade-offs. Like, hey, can I get 90% of this if it's cheaper? And so, that type of trade-off management is what is more or less prohibited by this system, right?
It
or
is
discouraged.
I mean, trade-off denial is so endemic to government. I think that lately it's been kind of pinned more on the democratic culture, and I think that's frankly a little fair. But I'm sad as a Democrat, but there really is this thing of like we can do all the things. So we should probably define product management. I mean, this is not a canonical definition, but project management, which is, that's everywhere in government. Project management is the art of getting things done. Product management is the art of deciding what to do. And I kid you not, there have just not been product managers in government, even though we have had digital products. And in fact, a policy is a product, right? A policy, like somebody is making decisions about what's in and what's not and what's out in order to, have it work, right? You just can't load every policy, every program, every digital interface up with everybody's wish list, or you get, frankly, what we've been getting. It just doesn't work. And so the product management, now we're starting to have product managers in the digital parts of government, and that's really good. They're not always empowered. Like you can have the title, but not actually the authority, because nobody around them understands that that's their job to make some decisions and say, actually, no, especially the first version of this thing isn't going to have your whole laundry list. It's going to meet user needs, not meet government needs, right? We're going to hide some of this complexity from people. We're going to make this work, and that means saying no to people. But like the parallel really is not just in digital products, it's in policy making, where the politics of making any given policy these days need to more account for the fact that if you wanted to do the main thing, right? Like it can't do 17 other things that also would be nice to have. You see this a lot in procurement. So to give an example, like the city of San Francisco years ago decided that to promote their values around support of LGBTQ people, they would not contract with any state or did not do any business with any state that didn't support LGBTQ people. So that meant that like their toilet paper, and I'm not making this up, like provider that they'd been using for a long time that got bought by a company in Georgia, and Georgia had bad policies. They had to fire them and come up with a new contractor for this. Like it created enormous amounts of bureaucratic overhead. It increased the costs of pretty much everything, and it did not do anything for the rights of those people. Like,
and so when the law was presumably when the policy was made,
because they couldn't sell to San Francisco.
Yeah. So no one came and said, "Hey, this is what it's going to cost you. This is how it's going to, this is the trade-off. This is what it's going to cost you to do this, right?"
It was totally missing until it was like really, really, devastating to the city's ability to function, and then they repealed it. Like the trade-off became apparent, But we need to have those conversations about trade-offs when we're making the policy, not when we are suffering from the consequences of them. This is a concept that Ezra Klein has termed the everything bagel. It's like and to be clear, what he's saying is the everything bagel is the best bagel. I'm not sure I agree with that, but this is his standpoint. But the everything bagel
Fair.
is the best bagel because it only has like 3, maybe 4 toppings. When you put 20 toppings on it, it does not taste good.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you quote Stanley McChrystal, who said, follow the spirit of the order rather than the details of the order. So, I mean, within government, there are branches of government that kind of, understand this to some degree. And it seems like there have been times in the past where it's been true. I mean, you quote Grace Hopper, who's a government employee, a military employee, and she's the one that actually, and I didn't know this, she was the one that came up with that term, ask for forgiveness and not permission. I mean, you don't hear anybody in government saying that now as to the degree that you hear it elsewhere outside of government, right?
Oh, I think people say it in government all the time, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of really great work gets done very quietly. I mean, part of the problem about talking about this is that, you're always then lifting up the stories of where things went wrong. And I'm guilty of that in my work because I want to pull those apart and dissect them and move on to something better. But in fact, a lot of what we need to do is elevate and celebrate those who do it right. Which is why I wrote a bunch about Yadira Sanchez and her team at CMS at the end of the book, and all the ways in which she did ask for. She didn't even have to ask for forgiveness. She just did the right thing and dealt with the consequences, and nothing bad happened actually because when they rolled MACRA out, because they made all of these really good decisions, which were not easy to make. I mean, a lot of people thought she was doing the wrong thing or her team was doing the wrong thing. It was lots of different people, not just Yadira, but they done things in a pretty unorthodox way. But, what happened is that they rolled out MACRA, and the day they launched it, they expected the slew of calls from angry doctors that they always got when they made a change, any kind of change. And instead, they got calls from people saying, I must be on the wrong website. This is too easy to use. They had very high satisfaction rates. They also delivered on time and under budget. So, the lesson really is, if you make the hard decisions while you're in it, you don't create the big, mess that then invites a bunch of oversight, right? But the other lesson is, what Congress should be doing instead of constantly calling up this public servant who did this little thing wrong or that one, is calling up people like Yadira and saying, thank you for, interpreting our words the way we actually meant them, even in the face of a lot of disagreement. Thank you for using your judgment, and thank you for shipping something that actually, helped make healthcare better. We love you. You're great. Everybody be more like Yadira. But they never do that. So the incentives are they only ever call people up when they're mad at them. Imagine if in a company, if the only performance management was you did something wrong and there was never, outside of the Partnership for Public Service has the SAMI Awards once a year. So they honor I think 100 people or something. There's 2 million government servants, public servants in federal government. That's it for saying you did a good job, especially from Congress. And if they just shifted to have half of their oversight time be finding people who did it right and took risks to do it right and elevating them, then a lot more public servants would be like, oh, that's the model I should aspire to, instead of my goal is to just never get in trouble.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people fail to appreciate how difficult it is to actually be a government employee. The systems are so archaic and so complicated. You point about this guy, it took 17 years just to kind of get up to snuff, right? Whereas, if you go to work at Salesforce, you can be productive on day one, right? Because the systems are designed to be, easier to operate.
That guy wasn't an outlier. Just to be clear, this was an unemployment insurance office in California during the pandemic, and it was, really just a realization that if you let the policy and processes accrue on a program like unemployment insurance for what's now 90 years, right? That came out of the Social Security Act of 1935. You get something that is so complicated that it takes, like, he wasn't like the slow guy in the class. Just like it takes 17 years to learn the complexities of the policy and process in that program. And that makes
And all the workarounds and the shortcuts and the macros, right?
Workarounds. And that makes it really hard to scale unemployment insurance up in times of great need and down in other times. And it's a really fragile, unscalable program because of it. And like, it's not his fault that he was still learning 17 years on the job. It's the fault of all the people who let that policy and process accumulate and not actually worked to reduce it. But we can do that now, right? One of the big things I'm advocating for is using LLMs to start to untangle these crazy webs of policy bloat. And I don't know the number for California, but in New Jersey, it's 7,119 pages of policy and on unemployment insurance that it's no human being is going to pull that apart without the use of AI. And we got to use AI for this now.
Right. And so you talk about how there is this accretion, both of policies, but also the accretion in technologies, right? So it's like it's like digging into the core of the earth, and you just have layer after layer, and you got some COBOL down here, and there's all this spaghetti code and so forth. And so, why is it that we can't just sort of blow it all up and just design it from scratch? On the tech side, separate from the policy side, why can't we just simplify the systems? Why is it that these countries like, I was just in Kazakhstan, I was just in Ukraine, I was just in the Emirates, and, it seems like their government services, the technology stack on the back of their government services is in ways better than ours.
Oh,
perhaps because they're starting with a clean slate. It seems like the longer you've been doing this, the harder it is to pivot.
Well, I think one of my mantras is that technology modernization without policy and process simplification is pointless. And we don't do it that way, right? When we talk about technology modernization, what we mean is take those 7,119 pages of policy and guidance and re-implement them now in the cloud instead of on a mainframe. It still sucks. But if you're in Estonia, you just don't have that 7,119 pages because you started your program yesterday and it was designed for the modern era. It hasn't, it wasn't designed in 1935 and then edited and added to, again, there's this thing where we always add, never subtract. It's not true. In some cases, something, repeals a prior rule, but that old rule sort of is still present somewhere in the code and as an artifact. So, you asked, why can't we blow it all up? You cannot blow up the technology without blowing up the policy. I think we're in a moment where there is far more interest in just blowing it all up than there was. And doing it much more responsibly than some of what we've seen, in federal government recently. But we're not there yet. There's just still so much attachment to the status quo. Like we need to actually, I think we would be fine to really, stoke the notion. We just need to move the Overton window towards blowing it all up. I don't think that means that we end up blowing it all up, but I think that buys us ultimately the permission, because you do ultimately need permission, right? To, when it's the law, I guess one thing I'm not down with is actually violating the law. What I am down with is changing the law to get the outcomes that we want, right? And so if we move that Overton window, I think we can force our lawmakers and policymakers into doing their job of, come back to me with a good 100 pages that describe the unemployment insurance program. All it is we're going to give you some amount of money for some number of weeks under some circumstances, and if you lose your job. you could describe an effective program that does that in 100 pages, and that would be a scalable program. But our lawmakers have to realize that's their job, not shouting about X, Y, and Z, and not adding more procedure, which is currently what they mostly do. So we, the public, have to hold them accountable to doing that policy and process simplification that would enable the tech blow up or the tech redo, like big reboot.
So maybe you could articulate for us, which I think is one of the key ideas in the book, which is, the concept of waterfall, right, versus agile. Most people think of it as a technology concept, but it's really about decision making in general, right? I mean, it applies to the policy side as much as it does to the tech side. In fact, they're not even separable, right?
Yeah.
You need sort of a unified way of integrating the policy and the implementation. What would that look like? I mean, I get the idea of bringing tech talent in-house and having a better sense of internal capabilities, but in terms of the lawmaking and the policy design, how would that look if we did it in an agile fashion?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. One is that you need a feedback loop that starts with lawmakers and then loops back down to the regulatory level and the implementation level. Always, like, it envisions really a new kind of lawmaker, right? Who goes in and says, okay, I authored this bill. I'm now going to conduct quote unquote oversight, but it's very different from what it looks like today. I'm going to check in with the agency and say, okay, so you've written the regs. Can we, do you think the regs that you've written are sort of still consistent with the intent that we did? And by the way, Republicans love this, right? Because they think that the agencies are all berserk and going off the rails. But it's really just a check on, like, how's it going? What are you learning as you're writing the regs, and what that we need to know, and what barriers are you facing to implementation of this that we can now fix? Because when teams go awry, it's not always just because the law was written badly. It's because there are other laws out there, by the way, kind of a lot of them, right, that are constraining you in a different way. So you go to do this and you're like, well, actually, we can't do this because this other law exists. You need to be able to go back to the lawmakers and say, we can't get this done because that's in our way. Please clear that barrier for us. And then all the way down to the implementation, like, what is UDERA's user research team finding out about how doctors feel about that? Like, the lawmakers need to have that full return where they're getting, all the learnings from that whole implementation stack, essentially, and informing them, oh, okay, so next time when I go to write a law, I'm going to keep these things in mind. Like, one way I see this, actually, since you brought up Paperwork Reduction Act, is like, there are so many more staffers now who, like, tell me, by the way, I wrote PRA exemption into my new law. Like, they get that that's a problem for the agencies, so they want to write in to their law that on this program, PRA will be exempt, and this is the only way you can get them out of it. So that's like a learning you see them doing, but we need a lot more of that. And then the other feedback loop is just pushing it from the other direction, right? Like, if your front lines, not just like the user research on a digital team, but like the call center people, the social workers, the agricultural inspectors, right? They are constantly learning, right, and getting feedback. The way a good example of this would be Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez wrote last year about hearing from one of her constituents who ran a daycare that the regulations prevented them from serving fresh fruit to kids. And so they were serving chips, though they wanted to serve like bananas. And she was like, well, is that true? And went in and looked at what the law doesn't say that. But it says a whole bunch of other things, or the regulations require a whole bunch of other things. Like, if you're going to do food prep, you need like X number of sinks per kid and blah, 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 blah. And like, on a practical basis, it was absolutely true that this daycare could not legally cut up a banana unless it invested like many thousands of dollars more money and a bunch more plumbing and a bunch more sinks that really weren't necessary, right? That's learning that's coming from the low level that needs to make its way back up. And it just, it doesn't yet. Very often, it's the rare legislator like MGP who like really listens and goes and digs in. There was another example of this just last week, I think, where, California is trying to build a bunch more new housing. And this guy on Twitter, who's trying to build some like semi-affordable housing in, very, very high district. They've submitted their plans to the San Jose permitting office, right? And it comes back rejected with a photo of a ruler sitting at the margin and showing that the margin is an 1 1/8 inch, not 1 inch. And therefore, all their work has been rejected. And they complain about this. And Mayor Matt Mahan says, I'm going to look into this. And he comes back and he says, well, we shouldn't have done that. But here's why my team did that, because we don't care about the margin. Unclear if that's true or not, but whatever. But we know that the state will reject you for a 1 1/8 inch margin, or for using a blue ballpoint pen instead of a black one, or for, stapling it instead of paper clipping it. Like, they have this whole list of things that are totally de minimis that they will, and just technical, that they'll reject you for. And so we're trying to prevent you from like going further down the road and then getting rejected later. But like, let's go work, and like, that's insane. We need more housing. We should not have rejected you for this. Let's go talk to the state about also like not rejecting you for these super, super minor, de minimis things. That's the kind of engagement where they're actually hearing, like, if you're a leader in the state of California, you should care deeply about anything that is keeping us from building housing. And if it's 1/8 of an inch on a margin, track it down, right? That's learning from your people what is a real barrier and doing something about it.
Yeah, there was this great story about someone who went and took this video of this guy, right, a testimonial, where he was explaining how he couldn't, get through on the website. And it seemed like that kind of personal narrative moved the needle, right? It actually motivated people to, get things done, to actually see directly the problems that were being caused by poorly designed
over
policies,
and over again. That's the only thing that breaks open these conversations. I mean, I tell a story in the book about, back when the Veterans Administration was struggling with all this stuff and the concrete boats, they really couldn't get anywhere. And it was a couple of researchers at USDS who, Marion Brody and Elizabeth and Emily Tavalarius, who went and just, took screen. They didn't have his face in it, but this guy Dominic, they did screen capture and audio of Dominic trying to get through the site and talking about how many times he'd tried and how it failed, and seeing the errors. And it's that Marina Nitsa brought that to the Deputy Secretary of the VA and showed that video. And every meeting that had happened before that about this problem, the website just didn't load for people outside the building. Like, you had to have a very particular combination of Internet Explorer and Adobe Reader, or it wouldn't open, and that nobody else outside the building had that particular combination. But like, they'd had a million meetings about this. All they got was like, this meets all the requirements of a contract. It is done. It works. And everybody in the building can use it. And nothing broke through until they brought Dominic's actual voice and his actual words and his real frustration, and a real person, not actually in the room, but like virtually in the room, to break through. And then it got fixed almost immediately. But you have to make it real for people. Like, it can't be abstract. There's a line from another guy who sort of fights this fight. He's like, you can't fight paper with paper. The only thing that works is like human voice.
Well, now in terms of actually moving the needle, a lot of people like to make fun of these congressmen who don't understand Facebook's business model and have their emails printed out and so forth. I mean, do we need to have legislators who are a little bit more tech savvy, or do they just need to, have staffers and a team and people who can, communicate with the people who are doing the implementation?
I don't think, for me, it's not about whether you're good at, use Facebook or know what the cloud is. For me, it's about, what do you think your job is as a legislator or any kind of elected official? And I think, again, this comes from the public. Like, the public has to change first, and we have to hold our government, our electeds accountable to something different. So the way I talk about it is like, electeds think that they're gardeners and their job is to plant the seeds. And like, if they plant, like, their seed is a law, right? And what they talk about is, I wrote this law and then it got passed, so the seed got planted. And the idea is that it's going to grow into something that provides shade or fruit or flowers. And that's what that's the benefit. That's why you get reelected. And the truth is, those seeds are not growing into anything meaningful. So why do we care about the seed planting? Getting your law passed is all nice, but like, name me a law that's had like a really important impact recently. They're just not, the impacts. I mean, even, this is maybe a very spicy example, but like, even when the far right got Roe versus Wade overturned, their goal was to decrease the number of abortions, and the number of abortions went up. But like, much more, less spicy examples are just like, we have had 100 laws over the past 7 years in California to increase housing. We don't have any more housing. So your nice seed planting you're doing, but we're not getting that shade or fruit or flowers. And the reason is that anybody who's ever gardened knows that seed planting is like 1% of the job. The job is the soil and the water and the sun and weeding out what was left before. We're trying to plant seeds in depleted, overcrowded, weedy soil that isn't fertilized, has no water. But like, no politician wants to think of themselves as like tending an organic system. They want to like do their thing. Like, I wrote this law. We should hold them accountable to all of that tending.
Yeah. Well, there's this great quote that you end the book with. It's this guy, Carl Deutsch. He says, "Power is the ability to afford not to learn."
Yeah.
Right. And so, maybe we need to have a different vision of power, which is one that is doing a lot more learning.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, people are talking about the Democrats being out of power, and I do think the Democrats didn't learn as much as they should while they were in power. And I think the big question is, now that they are out, will they learn, and what will they learn? And I think there's a real risk that they learn the wrong lessons, that they go towards the everything bagel with the 30 toppings instead of the 20, and that they just more and more try to do it all instead of try to do what works, and a whole bunch of other things. But yeah, we ought to be in like peak learning moment now. That ought to be everyone's goal. There's a lot of tests going on. The question is, are we going to learn from those tests and really create not just a moment of test and learn, but create a government that is fundamentally about testing and learning what works?
Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me. The book is really fantastic. It's called Recoding America. It's got some great stories and some really insightful ideas. So thanks for joining me.
This is great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.